Today's keynote speaker is Ross Lowrey, who co-founded Fast Track Australia to advocate for high-speed rail in Australia. Fast Track has produced many research papers on how high-speed rail will generate growth and development in regional Australia and how it will be done to ensure its benefits are optimised. Fast Track is currently working with colleagues and the Rails Futures Institute to apply these lessons to the high-speed rail corridor in Victoria. Whilst Ross acknowledges the Capstone project in Australia is a high-speed line between Melbourne and Sydney, he cautions that for it to be successful, it must be done in the right way. This includes integrating the high-speed line with the existing network to allow faster regional trains to get more regional centres, and the need for a concerted effort by governments and industry to facilitate development in regional centres. Ross will explore what would happen in the North East Corridor from Melbourne to Albury-Wodonga if it is done right. Ross is a retired business consultant focusing on advanced IT systems of government and the telecommunications industry. Since retiring, Ross has developed a deep interest in regionalisation and specifically whether high-speed rail is needed to facilitate it. Ross.
Thanks, David. So hands up if you think Australia can afford high-speed rail. Sorry, little fun. If you think we cannot afford high-speed rail, it's not as many as I thought. That's good. All right. The other thing they did then is that this is the only reason they looked at it. So basically to compete against planes. So Sydney, Melbourne take about 50% of the traffic out of the air into land-based travel. The study found that the trains would pay for themselves, so there'd be more than enough passengers paying enough revenue to pay for the trains, but it'd take about 50 years to pay back the infrastructure. And that's what made it risky. 50 years, politicians are in government for maybe 3 years, so 50 years is like never. So no government was prepared to actually go through, which is why we haven't got high-speed rail. Now we know that you need high-speed rail to grow regional areas. So let me just explain that. This is what I think highlights it the best. So however, this map of Europe shows you at different speeds, basically. So down here is 5 hours, 5 hours, 5 hours. So a distance on any of these is exactly the same time, not distance though. So here we have, if you were travelling at 60 kilometres an hour, basically Europe's as big as Europe is, right? That's a map of Europe. In 1993, Britain had fast trains. There were a number of fast trains around, but we were getting up to about 200 kilometres an hour. And you can see that it's really made a big dent in what the size of Europe appears to be. 30 years later, 2020, just a few years back, look how it's all scrunched up. And it's still scrunching up more. It means that you can get anywhere in Europe reasonably easily just by jumping on a train. And getting on a train is quite simple. So that's what happened back in around 1993? China. Everyone knows how big the Chinese network is, but China built rail not to compete against air, but to spread their economy, because they'd spent a lot of money on trying to get their economy growing around the seaboard with their special economic zones back in the 80s. And then their problem was, how do you spread that economy back into the rest of China? And so high-speed rail was the answer. Connect up the inland with the seaboard, and also because Beijing's in the north, to connect the north to the south. So they built a grid network of high-speed rail. Everybody realised then that the economic development of regional development was the reason for building high-speed rail. as a result, not only in Spain or countries all over the world, as we mentioned, have built high-speed rail. This map tries to show you, so I'm sorry it's faint, maybe you can print it out and send it in if people are interested in seeing these things, but it's a schematic trying to show how far it is from Melbourne or from Sydney, and Wagga's about 2 hours from Melbourne and Sydney. So Shepparton would become within an hour, and so that's the lines, and so basically all of this corridor becomes really quite compact, a bit like the previous map. There's two things that happen, which we now know with high-speed rail. The first thing is that a 2-hour trip, people will make a 2-hour trip to go somewhere for a day's work or whatever, and then come back. So, you know, if you live in the country, you might come down for a medical appointment and then go back home. So 2 hours is about the time, the travel time, so it's 4 hours travel time out our day, if you don't have to do that on a day-to-day basis. So that's when, so what happened, Japan's a good example. They started building factories between Tokyo and Osaka because it was cheaper to build them there, and they were less than 2 hours apart. So if you were a manager or anything, you could get to the factory, or if there were people at the factory had to come to the head office, they could do it easily. And so all of the places between Tokyo and Osaka that had a rail station, they started thriving. People were moving into them. The other thing is that you get a population shift if that travel time is less than an hour. So people allow about an hour. I mean, if you live in Ringwood now, it's an hour's trip into Melbourne, just by train now. So you could live in Shepparton here, and with high-speed rail, it would be a bit under an hour into central Melbourne. So if you've got a job in central Melbourne, you could choose to live in Shepparton, or alternatively, if you live in Shepparton as a kid, you go to university, you get a job in Melbourne, but you can live in Shepparton. So places in the corridor out here will become commuting distance, where, and in fact, and Derek will probably back me up on this, but Albury-Wodonga, for instance, got a lot of investment around the Whitlam years. It hasn't really developed since then, and the biggest problem is that people find it just too far from Melbourne and Sydney, and so ultimately they generally move back to the big smoke, which is why Melbourne is 80% of Victoria's population and 85% of our growth, so mainly immigration. So Melbourne's getting bigger at the expense of all the rest of Victoria. The same with Sydney. And then we complain about our urban congestion. Well, let's spread out. But to spread out, we need high-speed rail. Just to prove it, the latest study into the high-speed rail was to connect Sydney to Newcastle. They then also took it out to, or the study also took it out to the Western Sydney International Airport, which will become obvious when you start to look at it, because all of this will be from Gosford through Sydney, through to Western Sydney Airport, will be in tunnel. So it's the most expensive part of high-speed rail that you could possibly do in Australia. But the benefits, 60% nearly, is housing growth. So that's population shift into this, there's no area to before Gosford, which is the Hunter River, the Hawkesbury. So all of the growth will be from Gosford to Newcastle. So there'll be very large housing or population growth, therefore housing growth, and the economic activity in Newcastle. So again, you'll be, what they're designing it for is to make Newcastle, Sydney about 1 hour. Now, because it's in tunnels get extremely expensive if you try to make it 300 kilometres an hour. So they'll be designing for 200 kilometres an hour, which is quite normal for a tunnel. So you're not talking about this distance should easily be done if it was not in tunnel, well within an hour, but in tunnel, it's going to take about an hour. The point I want to make though is that the ridership and rail infrastructure, so the number of new people using the train, or the money you don't have to spend on freeways because you've spent them on the train and more people are using, therefore less cars, they're 19% of the benefits of this extremely costly part of the network. We won't get that sort of 80% regional benefits from the rest of the network, but it's likely to be 50-50. So while this Sydney-Melbourne was justified for its rail benefits, but was a marginal business case back in 2012, if they do that now, the benefits will be doubled because you've got all the regionalisation benefits included, and that will then make it a positive business case. So I'll talk to you a bit more about that, but the questions about the economics. Yeah, so what you're pointing out, if those of you that couldn't quite hear the question, is it the mayor, the Ballarat was worried that Ballarat will become a dormitory suburb if you've got a fast train to Melbourne. In other words, people will live in Ballarat but not work there, they'll work in Melbourne.
They're doing it there.
Yeah, a lot of people do that now. There's a lot of travelling. It's about 65 minutes, so it's right on that cusp. It's a bit long. Upgrading that line, you don't need high-speed rail. Upgrading that line, removing, separating the regional train from the suburban train, we could easily get it under 60 minutes. Ballarat's a case though of being under 60 minutes that yes, you will get more people living in Ballarat who work in Melbourne. But if it's only a 60-minute away, you're also going to get businesses that say, we can base our facilities. These days we've got to think much more about services than manufacturing. So it's not quite like Japan. So it's not going to be an industry potentially creating a factory. But so for instance, I know Ballarat got some data centres some time back. So those sorts of facilities that will be cheaper to build there and therefore have employment in Ballarat. Another question?
My understanding of China's move to high-speed rail was mainly for freight. And I suspect I may be wrong there. What benefits do you think high-speed rail in Victoria would have from freight?
Okay, two things. The high-speed rail doesn't carry freight. China, we all know how much China's done in high-speed rail. It's done 4 or 5 times that amount in its rail network. So it's built, 30,000 kilometres of high-speed rail. That's brand new rail. It's done well over 100,000 kilometres of freight and ordinary passenger rail. So I mentioned they were trying to connect the seaboard inland. I mean, they've done it with all types of growth. Freight in Australia, I wasn't going to mention this in the talk, but on our site you can find it. We think freight could be carried on high-speed rail in Victoria, in Australia. One of the reasons is that we don't have the volume of passengers. So it is possible it's 4 hours between Melbourne and Sydney. So if you wanted to be in Melbourne at 9 o'clock, start of a business day, if you're leaving Sydney at 5 o'clock, that's not going to happen. So there's a bandwidth where freight trains, but now they'd have to be specialised. I'm not talking about your standard container freight trains that you've got now. They'd have to be specialised high-speed trains, but you could carry some freight in a time period on the high-speed rail, and that would make the case of a high-speed rail extremely strong. You've then got not only population change and passenger change, but you would have breakage as well. Another question too.
Just one comment.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is the net? Oh, sorry, can you just talk briefly about the environmental benefits or costs of fast trains, say, compared
got
with?
that. I'll take your question.
Yeah.
So did everybody get the question, or do you?
Yeah.
Yes. So there's a couple of things. Sorry, the HS, the working from home, and who's going to use it. So the three things that people observe with high-speed rail. The first thing is tourism goes up enormously. Uzbekistan is a great example where they built it for tourism. So they've got international tourists coming into Uzbekistan because you can now get to the two really key things on the old Silk Road. But it doesn't matter. Even in China, the first thing that occurred is travel to tourists going to regional areas that they couldn't get to before in time. So tourism goes up immediately. Then you see the people moving into regional areas because they can travel back into the other areas. Now that's either for jobs or for their lifestyle. So that and this is then where I'm talking about a regional benefit. So it's proven that people doing the same job in a regional area versus doing it in Melbourne are more productive because of the input costs are lower in the regional area than they are in Melbourne. So the productivity of the state goes up just by having people move into regional areas, still doing the same jobs. So you've got a benefit. Now, how do we realise that benefit and pay for a railway line? That's a real question. But there is a real benefit worth the investment in high-speed rail. And then the third one is business benefit, the business relocation. So you'll see that follow on. These are all real. That's what they're measuring here. And there's no doubt that will occur because everyone in Sydney is saying this is fantastic. I can go up and live in the Central Coast, or I can move my business. I mean, that is a real benefit.
Ross, if you want to continue presenting before the next lot of questions.
That was my last question I'm taking now. I can go through the rest relatively quickly, but the thing I wanted to point out is that high-speed rail is not just a rail engineering project. It's actually all of these things on top that have to happen. If we run it, say, into Shepparton, and you wouldn't run through Shepparton, you'd put a spur or a loop line through, but then Shepparton would get a station in Shepparton. People from Shepparton could then, as I said, work in Melbourne. But you don't want people driving to the station in the middle of Shepparton. You can't have a car park there for everybody that's going to use it. So you must have a good local transport system. And so everywhere that's got high-speed rail has got a good local transport system at the stations where they occur, or a big car park if it's in the middle of nowhere. You then need to think about the urban development that's going to occur, particularly if people move into regional areas. And then on top of that, you need to think about the economic development that's going to occur. Cost. The big problem at the moment is everybody's talking about building high-speed rail from Sydney to Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, Sydney, Brisbane. But what we're saying is that if you integrate it with the existing rail line, which is what they do in most countries of the world, then you can build it in stages. So by building a tunnel from Southern Cross to Broadmeadows, you free up all of the So the black line is the existing rail line and the red's the high-speed line. You free up regional trains out into the north of Melbourne. it's possible. I mean, eventually Southern Cross is going to be a major high-speed rail station. We can expand that to the north of Latrobe Street. It could become a major development. Put a plinth over the rail yards or the rail lines that are under there. There's plenty of room for development. You can bring in your trains into platforms, and so there's an opportunity for massive development and for become a prestige rail station, and that's quite common around the world now. There are plenty of stations that are built like that in most countries. We'd also open up Broadmeadows, so we could come we're a long way from Box Hill here, but those of you that see pictures of it, I can tell you, I live near it. There's a dozen 10 to 20 story buildings, and there's plans for another dozen. It is a mini Melbourne. Then you can build the line out to a connection to Seymour. So then your trains going up to Shepparton or to Wodonga get sped up and opens up. Now Seymour would become a commutable town, meaning the jobs wouldn't move into Seymour more than likely. Shepparton, Wagga, and so on. So by the time you've got to Wagga, they'll have come down from Sydney, and then you can move into high-speed trains. So this probably tries to explain that a little bit better. What we're saying, fast track, is that what we need is fast commuter trains initially. So the fast commuter trains would come from Melbourne, they'd go to Seymour originally, and then on to Shepparton later. They can be battery operated, so we don't need electrical power. Battery operated trains run 160 kilometres without a charge, so not a problem. They operate at something like 160 to 200 kilometres an hour. That's plenty, fast enough to make these commutable. Then fast regional trains. These are old style trains. It's an engine. In this case, that's an electric engine. That's a diesel engine, and then they're just carriages behind it. They can then run out on the high-speed line and then up through Wangaratta to Wodonga and potentially onto Wagga. And then ultimately, when the whole high-speed line gets built all the way through to Sydney, that's when you would invest in high-speed trains. So that means we start getting benefits. So it might take, 30 years to build Melbourne-Sydney? The first stage would probably take about 10 years or so to do the tunnel. And then these stages are relatively simple, because getting through Victoria is the easiest part of high-speed rail in Australia. So these wouldn't take anywhere near as long. So we would start getting benefits in Victoria well before the high-speed line gets through to Sydney. So the issue then is to grow our regional cities. The question is, how do we do it? How do they do it? There's a sort of a central Melbourne style, and then you've got the gradually decrease. Well, we're starting to see some of this happening already. There's townhouses near in North Wagga, near the river. Fairly large development. This isn't just, there's a couple of pictures, but that's much higher density than the rest of Wagga. Then you've got the relatively low apartment complexes. This is in Kingston in ACT. And then the mixed-use retail centre. So this is actually built over a supermarket where they've got the apartments above it. But that's the sort of thing that's happening around the world with train stations now. So train stations at the bottom and apartment living above. So you get high density around your high-speed station. So just quickly, just like to talk about what does this mean. Lowrey Wodonga being halfway, about 2 hours from Melbourne, 2 hours from Sydney, it gets that double benefit of so it'll become a really good place-based business if you've got clients, for instance, in Melbourne and Sydney. So we expect that Albury-Wodonga could potentially grow, yeah, who knows, massive. So what this is looking at it from a 300,000 people point of view. Now this is North Albury now. You can see there's a lot of green space. There's a lot of small houses on reasonably large blocks. Wodonga is newer. Houses are bigger, but the density is the same. Now this is very hard to see. I apologise. It's really faint. But all I'm trying to say is this is the footprint of Albury-Wodonga now. It's about 70,000 people. So what I wanted to show you is what it would look like under some scenarios for more people. 300,000 with the same density as what Albury-Wodonga is now. You can see that all of this is new. Out here, over here in Bonegilla is new. This is the area where they're looking to expand Albury-Wodonga now, but that'll be a massive footprint. And then you've got this all over here. Now you've got these mountain ranges around here, so there's not a lot of areas where Albury-Wodonga could grow, but that's the size of the footprint if they just grew it like they do now. If you then said, well, that's a bit silly, and I've called this a bush city, but let's build town centres like they have in Canberra. So in Canberra, the idea is you've got Woburn, Belconnen, big town centres, and so the state government, or the territory government, has actually moved its offices, some of its offices out into these centres. But they're large town centres, but they're large by Canberra standards. But if you did that, then you could concentrate your population in a few centres. It'd still be a very largely road-based system, so people would have to drive anywhere. This area is greatly reduced. These areas here are greatly reduced, but it's just a slightly smaller footprint. I'll just show you that again. So if you watch, you'll see the footprint goes down slightly. Now, the footprint goes down quite a bit more. What would happen if you put in, and I mentioned it, the transport system. So if we put in busways, that blue line there, and there's another one across there, an east-west busway, and I think there's another one here. So this is out through the university. Not whether you can see it, doesn't matter. The point being that more people will then live near these busways, because then they can get to any of the other places easily, and they don't need their car. And what the big problem is with the bush city and the previous city, the rural city, is that everybody's driving their cars. These places are going to be so congested that we're just exporting the problems that we've got in Melbourne and Sydney. So I think that's a reasonable approach. But then the other alternative is to think, well, if we're going to grow, why don't we think about how we should grow and perhaps put in a metro system. So by that I mean, I'm starting to think now in 30, 40, 50 years, a metro system will be automated. Sydney's got its first automated train. You look at Singapore, it's all automated, right? Yeah, all automated. So why are we even thinking about buses? Why aren't we thinking about automated trains? So these centres then become much more dense, and so the footprint goes down. So I'll just flip through those again. Oops, one more. If you build it like you do now, highly congested city, slightly better again. How do we pay for it? The trains have always been paid for by land. So right back in the original suburban line in London, Metropolitan Line, 1900, all of these red areas were owned by the rail company, and they were selling land by building their train line. And then what happens 30, 40 years later? the trains fail, the government has to take them over, but they've made a niche out of all of the land that they've opened up. Well, guess what? That's how the Glen Waverley line was built. Exactly the same thing. Although one slight difference, the government was aware of this by then, and so they levied a tax on new land development. Crossrail, very complex funding, but and I don't want to read it, but these things here are basically business development or housing development that's gone ahead with Crossrail. For our children or grandchildren, in our case, it's not something that we'll probably ever see in our lifetime, which is really unfortunate, but it's going to spread the population. The alternative, and we know it now, Melbourne's going to grow to 15, 20 million people. If we don't open regional areas, the only way to open them is high-speed rail or faster rail. We're advocating for both, but this is specifically about high-speed rail.
Now, I'm sure Ross would welcome some further questions if anyone would like to ask.
Thanks very much for your most interesting talk. I'm just interested in your opinion about the relative merits of high-speed rail to Melbourne to Sydney, probably via Canberra, versus Melbourne to Brisbane in stages, with the economic benefits that you've mentioned about opening up regional centres if you do it on more inland route. What do you think about that?
Look, at the end of the day, high-speed rail has to connect major economic centres. So you really need Melbourne, Sydney. Look, if Melbourne, Sydney was even 200 kilometres closer together, we'd have high-speed rail. But the opening up of the regional areas is really worth doing, and staging it so we get the benefits early instead of waiting sort of 15, 20 years before benefits start flowing. Makes a huge difference.
If you compare the cost benefits of fast rail in Victoria to suburban rail loop to Lowrey.
Yes, I have, but no, that's another hour's conversation.
I was going to ask a supplementary question. Will that rail loop take any cars off the road?
No. Yeah, so the answer's no. Look, there's enormous problems with the suburban rail loop, but I'll just have a question here. And I've got to answer.
But that was in greenhouse, other things. What's the benefit from that?
Okay. Sorry, I said I would, and I haven't.
Thanks very much, Ross. We heard an example from England of cost overruns.
Yeah.
We're familiar with cost overruns here. How can we ever trust the people that do the guessing or and why can't they get the costing right? You know, I mean, they're just off by a mile.
Look, the frank answer is to the politicians. If you're a politician and you want to get something out there that people are going to attract people, when you start saying things like we're going to build a suburban railway, no, a little bit of I won't say no, but just a little bit of analysis beforehand to determine. I mean, the concept of the suburban rail loop makes a lot of sense. So the concept passed, and therefore it gets announced as a project. But there's no, it was announced as a 50 billion project, and now we're told it's 34 billion to do 1/3 of the project, and nobody believes it's going to come in at 34 billion. So there's your real problem. Now, HS2 has another problem too, which is what we tried to do back in 2012, really push the boundaries. So they wanted to run trains that have never run that fast before, routinely, right? You can run a train at 400 kilometres an hour, but that's a one-off. Can you run it every day, day in, day out, 400 kilometres an hour? Now, they weren't 400, they were 360, but 320 was the norm. So they had to do testing. It's never been done before in order to prove that they can run it reliably. So they just set themselves up to fail. But that was a political decision, 360 kilometres an hour meant that you could theoretically get there sort of 10 minutes faster, and that 10 minutes might have made the difference on that magical 1 hour, 2 hour time journey. So that's where. Now, can I just answer this question on the environment?
You want to ask that question again?
I'm just interested in the special benefits of, or the exceptional benefits, if any, of high-speed rail compared with the alternative of ordinary rail or road or air.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure about the benefit, whether there's much environmental benefit between high-speed rail and ordinary rail. But the thing about rail, because it's because it concentrates a lot of people, then you don't have the obviously at the moment it's diesel cars will become electric, trucks will become electric. So there is a big difference in pollutants.
You still have to generate electricity.
Yes.
So you're probably
that's changing.
Any more questions?
Yeah, just one.
Thank you. Is there a single reason why we keep stuffing up the rail bed? Now you've got trains.
Yeah, that's ARTC. That's an institutional problem, interestingly enough. ARTC has been set up by the federal government to support national rail, so freight rail, nationally. And so New South Wales and Victoria in particular have leased their track to the federal government to run or to operate the national freight network. What the federal government is worried about is if they're running this, will they have to pay for the upgrades or anything like that? So they created a corporation which can only spend money that it generates off the rail freight operators. So whenever it builds something, it tries to do it as cheap as possible.
Exactly.
Paul Cratchit, you had a question?
Yes. My question was referring to the infrastructure. We have problems just getting power lines across the country. Goodness knows how we're going to go. Were you considering that the rail line would be elevated, or would it be on the ground?
Look, it's going to be all of those things. I mean, to get in and out of Sydney and Melbourne, we've got to have tunnel. The parts, possibly even northern Victoria because of flooding, maybe viaduct. It will certainly be above ground, well above ground, so there'll be embankments. If a train, so the line will bypass, basically though, in Australia, basically it's at ground. The problem, if you then start talking about the inland rail, the problem there is that the broad route hadn't been decided, and a lot of people then said we wanted to go through our town to make for the regional benefits. So the original idea of where it was to go was changed. That then ran it through environmentally sensitive areas, and so you compounded problems. Yes, there will be difficulties, but look, there's no reason at all why that ground can't be done.
I suspect in 50 years we'll get it built by the Chinese. Thank you.
So any final questions?
So if you couldn't hear the question, the fundamental question was what's the constraint that's preventing us from building high-speed rail, especially when we've got, in Sydney they've spent a fortune on metros, here we're spending a fortune on tunnels. So things are happening in Melbourne and Sydney, but the regional rail isn't happening. And particularly with high-speed rail, the issue is actually, again, it's a fundamental issue with our constitution that the state wanted responsibility for rail back in the 1900s. Rail was really critical to the to each of New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland. Since then, of course, rail has become expensive to run, and so all of the states would like to get out, which is why they would like to move the cost over to the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth, of course, is saying, "Oh, no, we don't want a bar of this. All you're trying to do is shift the cost." So the states are unlikely to want to give up their railways, though. I mean, where a railway goes and how it operates is pretty fundamental to how a politician thinks of the state. So we've got to work out a way where the state and the federal government work together. We've looked at it at Fast Track. We think the answer is going to be in terms of ownership of the rail lines, so that we're going to have to, which is done in China, interestingly enough. So the national government and the provincial governments each own high-speed rail line. And so therefore they're both on the hook for operating or whatever. Yes. So that's the fundamental solution, but that's going to take. And again, until that gets resolved, then neither the federal government nor the state governments are really keen to build high-speed rail.
Any other questions?
Ross, the average age in this room is 82. Are we all, any of us, going to see high-speed rail in Australia?
No way.
I wish I could say.
Why don't we get the Chinese to come in and put it in a few days?
Have the country.
Well, yeah, now.
I'm sure this will lead to some lively discussion over lunch. So I'll now ask Bob Wigg to give a vote of thanks to Ross. I should indicate that Bob Wigg is an expert on steam trains, so we've come a little way since the steam train.
Haven't come very far at all.
Thank you, Slab. I'm not an expert on steam locomotives or anything of that nature. And other countries, you know, it just, you can't understand why we don't do things. Other than the biggest problem are politicians who don't know what they're doing in the first place. But interesting. I hope you get somewhere. The one way around it is someone come up with an unlimited amount of money, and because they're looking at a brand new roadbed. It's, yeah, good luck. Thanks. That's what I can say. Good luck. And we'd like to show our appreciation of what you've said today.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much.